The courthouse air conditioning was busted. Or maybe it was just the suffocating heat of a dozen local news cameras pressing in. Flash, flash, flash. The strobe lights hit the marble walls, looking like muzzle flashes in a dark alley. Richard was falling apart right in front of me. My father. A 60-year-old corporate defense attorney currently drowning inside a $200 custom Italian cotton shirt. The collar was completely soaked. A single thick drop of sweat tracked down his neck, cutting through the heavy layer of his Tom Ford cologne. His eyes were wide, darting back and forth like a trapped animal cornered by a pack of dogs. "Chloe!" he hissed. His voice was a pathetic wet scrape against the chaotic noise of the reporters. He reached out his manicured fingernails, trembling in the air between us. "Chloe, please, you don't know what you're doing. You're destroying everything." I didn't blink. I didn't shift my weight. My feet were planted shoulder-width apart on the polished floor, hands clasped firmly behind my lower back. Parade rest. I stood perfectly still and watched the camera crews swarm him. I watched the foundation of his fake, perfectly curated life crack open and bleed out onto the 6 o'clock news. I looked at him the way a sniper looks at a paper target through a scope. No malice, no pity, just a shape in the distance. A problem that had finally been neutralized. His panicked breathing faded into white noise. The flashing bulbs blurred, turning into the gray, washed-out light of a rainy afternoon. Suddenly it wasn't the suffocating heat of a Chicago courthouse anymore. It was the biting, bone-deep cold of an October day in Pennsylvania. 3 months ago. The Rust Belt. Where the American dream went to rust and die. The nursing home sat at the dead end of a cracked asphalt road in Altoona. The smell hit you before the automatic sliding doors even closed. It was a vile, heavy cocktail. Cheap industrial bleach trying and failing to cover up the stench of stale urine, boiled cabbage, and canned mushroom soup. Room 114. Walter Dawson. My grandfather. He sat in a cracked vinyl chair by the window. He wore a faded red flannel shirt buttoned all the way up to his Adam's apple to fight off the relentless draft. He was staring out at a parking lot full of rust bucket sedans and dying weeds. Rain hammered against the thin glass. He didn't speak. He rarely did anymore. The silence in that tiny room was heavier than a Kevlar vest. "You're the only one who ever shows up," the floor nurse muttered. She was a heavy-set woman leaning against the doorframe, nervously clicking a cheap ballpoint pen. "It's a damn shame, a man like that, just left to rot." I didn't answer her. I just stood behind his chair. I placed my hand on his shoulder. It felt like grabbing a bag of dry twigs wrapped in thin tissue paper. I looked down at his hands resting on his lap, knuckles swollen with severe arthritis, deep jagged scars crisscrossing the back of his palms. This was the man who survived the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He had carried dead men through waist-deep snow while taking enemy fire. Now he was trapped in a filthy, underfunded room, abandoned by a society that only cared about the future and dumped by a son who found him financially inconvenient. 2 days later, I was forced to sit at the exact opposite end of the spectrum. The Chicago suburbs. The air smelled different here. No bleach, no rain, no rotting leaves, just the sharp synthetic scent of new money and profound ignorance. Richard's stone mansion was a fortress of hypocrisy. A brand new spotless Tesla sat plugged into the garage wall, humming quietly. Inside the dining room was a theater designed to make small people feel big. Crystal wine glasses catching the chandelier light. The sharp, obnoxious clink of solid silver forks hitting expensive porcelain plates. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. It was the tactical blind spot of the room. I never sit with my back to a door. Never. My spine was pressed against the wall, giving me a clear line of sight to the front entryway, the kitchen swinging doors, and the massive bay windows. "Chloe, for the love of God." My mother sighed. She swirled her $80 Chardonnay, eyeing my dark, stiff wool sweater with open disgust. "Why do you always dress so rigid? You look like you're about to inspect the silverware for dust. This is a family dinner. Drop your shoulders. Relax." I took a slow breath. In through the nose. 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth. Richard cut into his rare steak. The serrated knife scraped loudly against the plate, setting my teeth on edge. Leave her alone, Martha. She's used to that government standard issue life. Not everyone knows how to function in the real world. Not everyone knows how to generate actual capital. He pointed his dripping fork at me, a patronizing smirk plastered on his face. Speaking of dead weights, did you waste your precious military leave driving out to Altoona again to sit with that senile old man? The room went dead quiet. Even the hum of the massive stainless steel refrigerator seemed to stop. He's embarrassing the family. Richard continued chewing his meat open-mouthed. I pay good money for that state facility. He belongs there. He's out of his mind. A social liability? I didn't argue. Arguing was for civilians. Arguing meant you cared about their opinion. Arguing meant you had something to prove to people who didn't matter. Instead, I let my right hand drop to my lap. My thumb tapped against my index finger. Tap, tap, tap. Counting phantom rounds in a magazine. 1, 2, 3. I scanned the table. I looked at my mother obsessively adjusting the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. I looked at my father wiping grease from his chin with a monogrammed linen napkin. Soft, slow, oblivious. They were completely incapable of defending themselves if the front door was kicked in right now. They measured the entire worth of a human life by the balance of an offshore bank account. They had absolutely no idea what kind of monsters kept their comfortable little world safe while they slept. I pushed my chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. I didn't touch the food. I'm leaving. The memory snapped shut. Back to the raw, ugly present. Or rather, the night that finally forced my hand and started this whole war. My cheap rental room on the edge of the city. No heating. A street lamp flickered outside the filthy window, casting long broken shadows across the peeling yellow wallpaper. I was lying on top of the covers, fully dressed in dark clothes. You never know when the world is going to end. The digital clock on the scratched nightstand glowed red. 2:13. The phone screamed. It was a harsh mechanical ringing that tore right through the dead silence of the apartment. I didn't groan. I didn't roll over and fumble for the receiver. My eyes snapped open wide and alert. My heart rate stayed perfectly level. I reached out and grabbed the plastic receiver. The caller ID flashed a local Pennsylvania area code, Altoona. Dawson, I answered. My voice was gravel and ice. I listened to the frantic, trembling voice of the night nurse on the other end for exactly 4 seconds. I didn't ask questions. I didn't gasp. I slammed the phone down. The plastic cracked. The civilian world was gone. The switch flipped. 10 seconds. That was all it took. Standard issue Marine Corps combat boots. Laces pulled tight, double knotted. Grab the heavy canvas jacket. Grab the keys off the dresser. The cold autumn air hit my face like a physical blow as I kicked the front door open. I threw myself into the cab of my beat-up Ford F-150. I jammed the key into the ignition. The heavy engine roared to life, coughing thick white exhaust into the freezing black night. I slammed the gear shift into drive. The worn tires screamed against the cold pavement as I floored the gas pedal. The clock was ticking, and Walter Dawson was out of time. The roar of my truck engine faded into the harsh mechanical grind of Walter's failing lungs. Room 114 was pitch black. The only illumination came from the sickly green glow of the heart monitor next to the bed. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. It smelled of spilled rubbing alcohol, old sweat, and the distinct metallic copper scent of a body shutting down. I stood beside the narrow hospital bed. I did not cry. I did not hold a damp tissue to my face. I watched his chest rise and fall in shallow, violent jerks. The death rattle. It sounded like a heavy iron hammer striking a cracked pipe deep underground. Every breath was a war. I placed my hand over his. His skin was paper-thin, freezing cold to the touch. Suddenly, the irregular rhythm of his breathing stopped. His chest froze. Then, with a surge of terrifying, unnatural strength, his fingers locked around my wrist. The grip was bone-crushing. It was not the grip of an 89-year-old man dying in a forgotten Altoona nursing home. It was the grip of a United States Marine freezing in the dirt at the Chosian Reservoir. His eyes snapped open in the dark, blind, cloudy, but staring straight through me. He pulled me down. His cracked lips brushed against my ear. It was not a goodbye. It was a tactical briefing. "There is something hidden," he ground out. His voice was a wet rasp tearing his throat apart. "In the cabin. Do not let them find it." His fingers dug into my tendons one last time, delivering the order. Then his grip went entirely slack. His arm dropped to the mattress. The green line on the monitor flatlined, turning into a solid, piercing tone. I stood back up. I smoothed the wrinkled blanket over his chest. I checked the cheap plastic clock on the wall. 03:14 hours. Mission received. 3 days later, the hypocrisy was put on full public display. The cemetery was a sprawling manicured lawn of green grass and gray stone. The sky was the color of dirty lead. A freezing October rain fell in a slow, miserable mist. They buried him in a cheap oak casket that looked like it was bought on clearance. My mother stood at the edge of the artificial turf covering the mud. She was wearing a black designer dress and a wide-brimmed hat. She leaned heavily against a woman from her local country club, burying her face in a white lace handkerchief. Her shoulders shook perfectly on cue. A flawless, calculated Hollywood performance for the suburban elite. I stood 20 yards away near the tree line. I wore my dark dress uniform coat. Rain soaked into the wool, but I did not move to find an umbrella. My eyes tracked Richard, my father. He was not standing near his weeping wife. He was standing behind a large marble headstone, out of sight from the priest, shielding his expensive smartphone from the rain with one hand. My hearing was trained to pick up the slide of a rifle bolt in the middle of a screaming windstorm. I could hear him perfectly. "Yes, the Appalachian plot." Richard muttered into the phone, annoyed. He checked his gold Rolex. "I already have the deed paperwork drafted. We can bulldoze that rotting cabin by the end of next month. Look, just get the coal developers on the line." Honestly, he died at the exact right time. The land value is peaking. My back teeth ground together. The muscles in my jaw tightened until they burned. I looked down at my right hand. The glossy funeral program, the one with a terrible generic photo of Walter printed on it, was completely crushed. I squeezed it until my fingernails broke through the thick paper and dug deep into my own palm. On the battlefield, I had watched good men bleed out in the sand. When a soldier died, a dozen brothers wept, screamed his name, and carried his weight home. Here, a war hero died completely alone in a dark room, while his own flesh and blood calculated real estate profit margins over his open grave. They did not see a father. They saw a payday. 1 week later, downtown Chicago. The law office was located on the 40th floor of a glass skyscraper. The room was designed to intimidate poor people. Heavy mahogany desk, thick Persian rugs that swallowed the sound of your footsteps. The air was dry, smelling of expensive leather furniture and old paper. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the blank wall behind the lawyer. Richard sat next to my mother on the leather sofa. He looked deeply bored. His legs were crossed. He was tapping a heavy Mont Blanc pen against a leather portfolio resting on his knee. He just wanted the signature. He wanted the legal authority to liquidate a life he never respected. The lawyer was an older man in a charcoal suit. He cleared his throat, adjusted his half-moon reading glasses, and broke the seal on the thick manila folder. He read through the standard useless legal jargon. Funeral expenses, minor bank accounts. Richard shifted in his seat, leaning forward like a vulture, smelling blood. The lawyer flipped to the final page. He paused. He looked up, his eyes darting nervously toward Richard, then settling on me. "Regarding the property located in the Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia, and all of its physical contents," the lawyer read, his voice dropping slightly in volume. "I leave the cabin, the acreage, and complete uncontested control of the estate entirely to my granddaughter, Chloe Dawson." The room went completely dead. It was the exact kind of suffocating silence that happens right after a flashbang grenade goes off. The lawyer reached into the folder. He pulled out a smaller sealed envelope and pushed it across the polished mahogany desk toward me. "He also left this specific item for you, Chloe. The addendum simply reads, 'She will understand soon enough.'" Richard stopped tapping his pen. His face went dead white. Then a dark, violent flush of red crept up his neck. "Excuse me," Richard snapped. His voice cracked, stripping away the calm corporate lawyer facade. He slammed his hand flat against his leather portfolio. That is a mistake. That senile old fool did not know what he was doing. I am the direct next of kin. I am his son. That land sits on top of a highly profitable coal vein. It is worth $500,000 to the developers. I am contesting this garbage immediately. I didn't look at him. I did not acknowledge his tantrum. A predator does not concern itself with the screaming of its prey. I reached across the heavy wooden table and picked up the envelope. I tore the top off with one smooth motion. I tipped it over my hand. A single heavy brass key slid out. It was severely rusted around the edges, stained with decades of dirt and neglect. It felt freezing cold against my palm. This was not an inheritance. It was a weapon. Chloe, put that down, Richard commanded, standing up from the sofa. His chest was heaving. You are not taking that property. I closed my fist around the brass key. I stood up. I did not say a single word. I turned my back to my father while he was still yelling, treating him with the exact same level of respect he had shown a dying man. None. I walked down the long carpeted hallway. I pushed my way through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the freezing city wind. I walked straight to my beat-up Ford F-150 parked on the street. I ripped the heavy steel door open and climbed inside. I did not look back at the glass tower. I tossed the rusted brass key onto the plastic dashboard. Clack! I jammed the ignition key into the column. The heavy engine roared to life, violently vibrating the steering wheel under my hands. The mourning period was over. The campaign had officially begun. The heavy rain hit the windshield of the Ford F-150 like scattered gravel. The wiper blades squealed against the glass, fighting a losing battle against the storm. I crossed the state line into West Virginia just after dusk. The landscape shifted instantly. The polished highways disappeared, replaced by cracked, winding mountain roads that hugged the edge of deep, black ravines. This was the forgotten spine of the Appalachian Mountains, dead coal country. Every few miles, my headlights washed over the rotting wooden bones of an abandoned mining tipple or a boarded-up gas station. The air leaking through the truck's vents smelled like wet pine needles and diesel exhaust. I turned off the main road onto a steep dirt path that barely qualified as a driveway. The tires spun in the thick mud before finally gripping the gravel near the top of the ridge. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering skeletal oak trees. It was a one-story structure built from rough-hewn logs. The roof was rusted corrugated tin. No porch light, no power lines running to the street. A ghost house. I killed the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain on the metal roof. I grabbed my heavy canvas jacket and stepped out into the freezing mud. I pulled a tactical flashlight from my pocket, the cold aluminum casing familiar and grounding in my palm. I walked up the sagging wooden steps. I took the rusted brass key out of my pocket and forced it into the deadbolt. The lock was stiff, packed with years of grit, but it finally gave way with a loud mechanical clank. I pushed the door open. My right hand instinctively dropped to my hip, right where a holster should have been. Old habits do not die. I stepped inside and immediately went to work. I did not wander aimlessly. I moved with deliberate, sweeping steps. I cleared the fatal funnel of the doorway. I swept the blind spots in the corners of the main room. I checked the single bedroom. I checked the small, cramped bathroom. I checked the rusted latches on the heavy wooden window shutters. Clear, secured. The cabin was completely frozen in time. A thick layer of gray dust coated every surface. The air was stale, smelling of old ashes, damp wool, and something distinctly metallic. I clicked the flashlight on its highest setting. The beam cut a sharp, blinding white cone through the darkness, catching millions of dust particles suspended in the dead air. I needed information. I switched off the granddaughter side of my brain and let the intelligence analyst take the wheel. I started in the bedroom. I stripped the moth-eaten blankets off the mattress. Nothing. I pulled the heavy wooden drawers out of the dresser, dumping faded flannel shirts and thick wool socks onto the floorboards. I checked the bottoms of the drawers for false panels. Nothing. I moved to the small nightstand. Inside the single drawer sat a heavy leather-bound King James Bible. The cover was cracked and flaking. I picked it up. I didn't flip through the pages like a civilian looking for a favorite verse. I grabbed the book by its heavy spine and shook it violently. A single thick piece of stiff paper dropped out and fluttered to the hardwood floor. I kept the flashlight pinned on it. I knelt down and picked it up. It was an old black and white photograph, the edges yellowed and curled. 3 men in heavy winter parkas, completely covered in snow and dirt. They were holding M1 Garand rifles. Their faces were hollowed out, their eyes locked in that dead 1,000-yard stare that only happens when a man has seen the absolute bottom of hell. I flipped the photo over. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and pressed hard into the paper. It was Walter's handwriting. Chosin Reservoir, 1951. Not all heroes come home. My thumb brushed over the faded ink. My chest tightened. I had spent my entire adult life serving in combat zones, thinking I was the only one in the family who carried the weight of the dead. I thought my grandfather was just a quiet old man who fixed cars and eventually lost his mind. I was wrong. The man in this photo was a killer, a survivor, a ghost. I shoved the photo into my jacket pocket and kept moving. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin dropped near freezing. I needed to think. I grabbed a few dry logs from a stack near the door and tossed them into the massive cast iron stove sitting in the center of the main room. I struck a match and watched the flames catch the dry bark. I sat back on my heels, letting the meager heat wash over my face. The firelight flickered, casting long dancing shadows across the room. I stared blindly at the floor. My brain was running through logistical calculations, trying to process the layout of the cabin. Then I saw it. The firelight hit the wooden floorboards at a shallow angle. The illumination exposed something my flashlight beam had completely missed from above. Deep grooves in the oak floor. I leaned forward, my nose inches from the dusty wood. The scratches were brutal, gouged deep into the grain. They formed a distinct curved arc, a drag pattern. I followed the arc with my eyes. The scratches started near the wall and ended exactly underneath the heavy steel legs of the cast iron stove. I looked up at the black metal beast. It was a vintage industrial model, solid iron. My logistical training ran the math in a fraction of a second. That stove weighed at least 400 pounds. You do not accidentally bump a 400-pound piece of cast iron. You do not slide it out of the way just to sweep the floor. You only move an object that heavy if you are using it to hide something. I stood up. I walked out into the freezing rain and went straight to the bed of my truck. I grabbed a 4-foot solid steel pry bar and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. I marched back into the cabin, dripping wet. I jammed the flat-forged end of the steel bar right under the front left leg of the stove. I planted my boots on the floorboards, dropped my center of gravity, and threw my entire body weight backward. My shoulder muscles burned. The steel bar bent slightly under the massive strain. With a loud, violent screech of metal grinding directly against hardwood, the stove shifted. I reset the bar. I heaved again. Screech! The iron leg cleared the drag mark. I dropped the pry bar. It clattered loudly against the floor. Directly underneath where the stove had been sitting, cut perfectly into the floorboards, was a heavy steel trapdoor. It was locked down with a thick, rusted master lock. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the bolt cutters. I locked the heavy steel jaws around the shackle of the padlock. I squeezed the long handles together with everything I had. The rusted metal popped with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the small room. I ripped the broken lock off and tossed it aside. I grabbed the recessed iron ring handle and yanked the heavy door upward. A rush of stale, dry air hit my face. It didn't smell like a damp root cellar. It smelled like gun oil, preserved canvas, and ozone. I clicked my weapon light on. The beam cut straight down the dark hole, revealing a steep flight of poured concrete steps. I didn't wait. I climbed down into the blackness. The bunker was a perfectly constructed military-grade storage space. The walls were reinforced concrete. A commercial dehumidifier hummed quietly in the corner, keeping the air bone dry. Against the far wall sat a row of gray steel filing cabinets. On top of a metal desk in the center of the room rested a heavy portable cassette tape player. It looked like it had been sitting there waiting for decades. I walked up to the desk. The thick layer of dust was undisturbed. A single cassette tape was already loaded into the deck. I reached out. My finger hovered over the heavy plastic keys. I pressed the solid play button. It depressed with a loud mechanical click. A few seconds of harsh, crackling static filled the concrete room. Then the voice cut through the noise. It was not the wet, rattling whisper of the dying man in the nursing home. It was not a senile old fool. It was the sharp, commanding, absolute voice of a United States Marine. If you are listening to this, Walter's voice echoed off the concrete walls. It means I am dead, and it means they lied to you. The voice cutting through the magnetic tape did not shake. It was pure gravel and iron. Walter Dawson, not the hollow, rattling shell rotting in an Altoona nursing home. This was the United States Marine. The tape hissed. Static crackled out of the heavy plastic speaker, echoing off the poured concrete walls of the bunker. I stood frozen in front of the metal desk. I did not breathe. November 1950. Walter's recorded voice continued. I could hear the sharp metallic flick of a Zippo lighter over the recording, followed by the deep, wet inhale of a cigarette. The chosen reservoir, 30 degrees below zero. The cold killed more boys than Chinese bullets. The brass gave the order to pull back. But they didn't just want a retreat. They wanted an escort. He coughed. A dry scraping sound. A convoy of wounded men got pinned down in a narrow ravine, bleeding out in the snow. We were ordered to leave them. Why? Because some high-ranking senator's kid was stationed 3 miles south. The brass wanted every available gun protecting his golden boy. I stared at the spinning plastic reels on the cassette deck. My chest tightened until my ribs ached. Frank, Eddie, and me, we told the lieutenant to go to hell. We broke ranks. We went back for the wounded. The tape hissed louder, filling the dead air of the bunker. It took 6 hours to break their line, hand to hand in the dark with fixed bayonets. Eddie took a mortar round directly to the chest. There wasn't enough left of him to put in a canvas bag. Frank caught a sniper bullet through the throat while he was dragging a kid onto the back of a truck. I was the only one who walked out. Silence, heavy and suffocating. We got the wounded out. The senator's kid made it home too, safe and sound in Chicago. But the Pentagon couldn't have a mutiny on the official record. They couldn't let the press know they abandoned 40 dying Marines in the snow to save one politician's son. So they erased it. Frank and Eddie died for nothing. They forced me out, stripped the commendations, told me if I talked, I'd spend the rest of my life rotting in Leavenworth. The tape player clicked loudly. The plastic reel hit the end of the spool. Silence crashed back into the bunker. I did not move for a long time. The commercial dehumidifier hummed in the corner. Survivor's guilt. That was the ghost haunting him. He didn't lose his mind to dementia. He was crushed by the weight of unacknowledged blood. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the row of gray steel filing cabinets. I grabbed the handle of the top drawer and yanked it open. It slid out with a loud metallic shriek. Thick manila folders, declassified Pentagon documents, hand-typed letters, tarnished dog tags resting in small plastic bags. He had spent decades down here building a shadow archive. I started pulling files. Dust coated my fingertips. I grabbed a thick stack of medical records. As I pulled them out, a single modern envelope slipped from between the yellowed pages. It hit the concrete floor with a soft slap. It wasn't old. It wasn't typed on a typewriter. I picked it up. My blood stopped moving. The handwriting. I would recognize those sharp, arrogant loops anywhere. I had seen them on birthday cards with a crisp $50 bill shoved inside. I had seen them on legal briefs. I had seen them signing checks at expensive steakhouses. Richard, my father. The postmark stamped on the corner read, October 1998. I unfolded the thick, cream-colored stationery. The letterhead was stamped with the gold foil logo of his Chicago corporate defense firm. Dad, it read, "Let it go. You are an old man obsessed with a forgotten war. If you take these documents to the press, the senator's family will destroy us. Do you understand my junior partnership is on the line here? If you drop this ridiculous crusade, the firm's political backers will make sure our family is taken care of. If you do not, I will have you legally declared incompetent. I will take full power of attorney. Do not force my hand." My vision tunneled. The edges of the thick paper dug sharply into my thumbs. He knew. Richard knew everything. My father knew his own father was a war hero. He knew about Frank. He knew about Eddie. And he traded their blood for a corner office-tailored Italian suits and a shiny new Tesla. The Altoona nursing home wasn't just a place to dump an old man who had become a burden. It was a calculated, deliberate isolation cell. Richard put him there to rot. He took away Walter's car, his phone, his access to the outside world. He locked a war hero in a chemically smelling room to protect a corrupt politician and his own bank account. He's a social liability, Richard had said at the dinner table. Now I understood what that actually meant. I did not cry. Tears are for people who feel helpless. I did not scream. Screaming wastes oxygen. A deep, unnatural cold spread from my chest down to my fingertips. The daughter who sat quietly at the mahogany dining table was dead. The woman who let them mock her military salary was gone. I looked at the letter. I looked at the tarnished dog tags resting in the open steel drawer. Richard did not just abandon his father. He committed an act of treason against his own blood. He measured human sacrifice in dollars and cents. I folded the letter exactly in half, perfectly square edges. I slid it into the inside pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen cast a harsh blue light over the dusty concrete floor. No service down here. I turned around and walked up the concrete steps. I pushed through the heavy steel trapdoor. The freezing mountain air hit my face. I stood in the middle of the dark cabin, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof. 2 bars of signal. I pulled up the contacts list. I tapped his name. I pressed the phone to my ear. It rang twice. Hello. Richard's voice was groggy, annoyed. The sound of a man waking up in a silk-sheeted bed, completely oblivious to the monster standing in the dark. Chloe, do you have any idea what time it is? I stared at the deep scratches gouged into the oak floorboards. I found the bunker, I said. My voice was flat, dead. The line went completely silent. The silence on the line stretched out. I could almost hear the gears turning inside Richard's head, racing to construct a lie. What bunker? He finally asked. His voice was a pathetic attempt at casual confusion. Chloe, have you been drinking? What are you talking about? I have the tape, Richard, I said. My voice was a flat line. I have the after-action reports. I have the medical files from the chosen reservoir. And I have the letter you sent him in October of 1998. A sharp, ragged intake of breath over the receiver. The sound of a man drowning in his own expensive bedsheets. Listen to me, Richard snapped. The panic bled through the lawyer facade. You do not understand the political implications of this. That senator's family still holds massive federal weight. If those files see the light of day, they will crush this family. They will crush my firm. Chloe put the files back in the ground. Tell me you did not show them to anyone. I looked out the dusty cabin window. The rain was turning into sleet, freezing against the glass. You dumped a war hero in a facility that smelled like piss and bleach, I said softly. You locked him in a box to protect your junior partnership. I took care of him. I paid for that room. You took away his voice. I cut him off. Cold, final. Now I am giving it back. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I did not block his number. I turned the phone completely off. I walked over to the old kitchen counter and plugged in a heavy industrial-grade coffee maker. I needed black drip coffee, strong enough to strip paint. The campaign did not require me to raise my voice. It required logistics. I spent the next 4 hours at the heavy wooden table. I did not move. I did not take a break. I organized the declassified Pentagon documents, the hand-typed letters, and the photographs into perfectly aligned stacks. I cross-referenced the names. Frank, Eddie, the commanding officer, the senator's son. By dawn, I had compiled 3 identical dossiers. I drove down the mountain to a small post office in a dying coal town. The clerk looked half asleep. I dropped the heavy manila envelopes onto the scratched laminate counter. I paid for overnight FedEx shipping. 1 copy went to a senior investigative reporter at the Washington Post. 1 went to the national headquarters of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. The 3rd copy went to an address in Ohio, Harold Delaney, Frank's younger brother. Then I drove back up to the cabin. I poured another cup of bitter burnt coffee. I sat in Walter's old rocking chair on the front porch. I watched the freezing rain wash the mud away. I waited. 48 hours later, The bomb detonated. I turned on the small static-filled television in the corner of the cabin. The volume was set low. The red breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen on CNN. There it was. A high-resolution scan of the black and white photograph, Walter, Frank, and Eddie standing in the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. Right below it, a scan of the official withdrawal order, heavily redacted, but completely recognizable. The anchor's voice was sharp. Professional outrage. A massive cover-up involving a sitting United States senator. A betrayal of the Marine Corps. But the real kill shot came 10 minutes later. The screen cut to live footage outside a federal courthouse in Chicago. The air conditioning inside was busted, so they dragged the press conference out onto the marble steps. The heat was suffocating. There he was, Richard. He was drowning inside a $200 custom Italian cotton shirt. The collar was soaked. A single thick drop of sweat tracked down his neck. His eyes darted around like a trapped animal. The microphones were shoved into his face, demanding answers about his 1998 letter, demanding to know why his law firm actively suppressed military records to secure political backing. "Chloe, you're destroying everything," he had hissed at me earlier that day. I sat in the rocking chair, sipping my coffee. I watched his career burn to ash on national television. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I did not smile. I just watched a target get neutralized. My phone buzzed on the wooden table. I picked it up. Caller ID, Mom. I swiped the green icon. I didn't say a word. "Are you insane?" The scream tore through the small speaker. She sounded completely unhinged. The perfectly manicured country club wife was gone. "They are freezing our assets. The firm is locking Richard out of the building. His partners are throwing him under the bus to save themselves. The press is camped on our front lawn." I listened to her hyperventilate. "Chloe, say something," she sobbed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "You are killing this family. How could you do this to your own blood?" I leaned back in the wooden chair. The floorboards creaked. "Blood just means you share genetics," I said. The words tasted like cold iron. "Loyalty is what makes a family. This family died 20 years ago when he locked Walter in that room. You just didn't notice the smell until today." I ended the call. I tossed the phone onto the couch. On the television, the chaotic footage of Richard being swarmed by reporters abruptly cut away. The seal of the Department of Defense appeared on the screen. The camera focused on the briefing room at the Pentagon. A 4-star general stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphones. He looked directly into the camera. He did not look like a man reading a script. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Effective immediately," the general's voice boomed through the small cabin speakers. "The Department of Defense is officially reopening the after-action reports regarding the November 1950 withdrawal at the Chosin Reservoir. The records of Private First Class Frank Delaney, Corporal Edward Vance, and Staff Sergeant Walter Dawson are currently under emergency review." The general paused. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium. "The United States Marine Corps does not leave its men behind. We intend to correct this." I reached out and pressed the power button on the television. The screen went black. The room was quiet again, just the steady dripping of rain off the tin roof. I stood up. I walked over to the hook by the door and grabbed my dark dress uniform coat. I brushed the dust off the heavy wool. I checked the alignment of the brass buttons. Perfect. It was time to bring him home. The April wind cut straight across the Potomac River. The geometry of Arlington National Cemetery is brutal. Hundreds of thousands of white marble headstones lined up in perfect unending rows. No cover, no concealment, just a sprawling silent grid of the dead. I stood at the edge of Section 60. My polished dress shoes sank slightly into the soft, wet earth. I wore my Marine Corps dress blues. The stiff high collar dug into my neck. The heavy brass buttons held the dark wool tight against my chest. No civilian clothes today. No hiding in the tactical blind spot. The Pentagon didn't invite the press. They didn't want the media circus. Just a 4-star general, a military chaplain, Harold Delaney, and me. The general stood behind a heavy wooden podium. He read the official citation. It took 50 years to print those words on government letterhead. Private First Class Frank Delaney, Corporal Edward Vance, Staff Sergeant Walter Dawson, for extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces at the Chosin Reservoir. Navy Crosses. Posthumous. 7 Marines raised their M16 rifles. Crack, crack, crack. 3 rifle volleys shattered the quiet morning. The sharp, bitter smell of burnt cordite drifted over the manicured grass. The bugler raised his horn. Taps. That slow bleeding melody. It doesn't sound like victory. It sounds like an open wound. 2 Marines folded the heavy cotton flag. Crisp, sharp movements, pulling the fabric taut until it formed a perfect, tight triangle. The general walked over. He pressed the folded flag into my hands. On behalf of the President of the United States. The flag felt incredibly heavy, but it wasn't a burden anymore. The medals didn't belong to the dead. They were just cold metal and ribbon. The medals were an apology to the living. Late that night, the adrenaline finally crashed. I was sitting in a cheap motel room right off Interstate 95. The air conditioner rattled in the window frame, blowing stale, dusty air over the faded carpet. I was cleaning my combat boots with a stiff nylon brush. The cell phone vibrated on the cheap veneer nightstand. Unknown number. I hit the green button and put it to my ear. Chloe. The voice was thin, scraped hollow. Richard. The untouchable corporate lawyer was dead. The $200 Italian shirts were gone. He sounded like an old broken man standing in the ruins of a collapsed building. They took the firm, he rasped. His breathing was ragged, catching in his throat. Martha filed the divorce papers this morning. I'm sitting in a hotel room near the airport. My accounts are frozen. The feds are tearing through my office. I didn't interrupt. I kept the stiff brush moving over the black leather of my boot. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I saw the broadcast, he whispered. Arlington. The static hissed over the line. Did he ever mention me down in that hole? It was a pathetic, desperate question. The old Richard would have demanded an answer. He would have threatened a lawsuit. This version of him was begging for scraps. He wanted absolution. I had the tactical advantage. I could have crushed his throat. I could have told him his father died thinking he was a coward who sold his own blood for a Tesla and a country club membership. But revenge is a civilian game. It doesn't fill the magazine back up. It just leaves you empty. Yes, I said. My voice was flat steady. He was proud of the man you were supposed to be. He was always waiting for you to come back. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then a wet, ugly sob broke through the receiver. He wept. Loudly. The sound of a man realizing he traded his own soul for a pile of cash that evaporated overnight. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I pressed the red button. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt done. 6 months later, West Virginia. The Appalachian mud was drying out under the hard-biting autumn sun. The rusted tin roof of the cabin was gone. Harold Delaney and I had spent the last 8 weekends ripping it apart. Harold backed his beat-up Chevy pickup toward the porch. The truck bed was loaded with heavy 2x4s and stacks of drywall. We didn't sell the dirt to the coal developers. We gutted the rot. Built 2 extra bedrooms. Reinforced the stone foundation. We turned it into a tactical retreat, a fallback position. Vets coming back from the sandbox with ringing in their ears and ghosts in their heads needed a place to disappear. No doctors asking stupid questions, no fluorescent lights, just silence, a heavy wood stove, and 100 acres of thick timber. We took the dirt Richard tried to pave over and turned it into a sanctuary. Truth cleared out the lies. Now we were building on solid ground. I stood in the underground bunker one last time. The commercial dehumidifier was unplugged. The air was already getting damp, smelling of wet earth and old concrete. The gray steel filing cabinets were empty. Every classified document had been handed over to the military archives. Just the bare walls and the metal desk remained. I reached out and pressed the heavy plastic play button on the cassette deck. The final tape. Walter's voice cut through the dark room. Power isn't measured by what you scrape together for yourself, the iron voice echoed, bouncing off the concrete. It's measured by the weight you are willing to carry for the man next to you. The tape clicked to a stop. I ejected the plastic cassette and slipped it into the inside pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I turned off the tactical flashlight. I climbed the poured concrete steps in the pitch black. I grabbed the heavy iron ring and pulled the steel trapdoor shut. Clang. Metal hitting metal. I slid a heavy steel padlock through the latch and snapped it closed. I walked out the front door onto the wooden porch. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, painting the tree line in bruised purple and dark orange. Mission accomplished. Staff Sergeant Walter Dawson was finally home. If this story hit home for you, please drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.